Somewhere between waking and sleeping is the perfect place to learn that the most powerful being on Earth got his abilities from a syringe. Not a distant planet, not a radioactive accident, just a very profitable corporation with very few ethical guidelines. The Boys is a show that most people describe as a superhero story, but that description barely scratches the surface of what it actually is. At its core, the whole thing is a really sharp piece of satire. It is asking a question that sounds simple but gets more complicated the longer you sit with it. What would the world actually look like if superheroes were real? And what if they were less concerned with saving people and more concerned with maintaining their brand image? The answer the show keeps arriving at, again and again, is that it would look a lot like the world we already live in, just with more explosions and considerably more chaos. The show is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis, who is known for writing some of the most deliberately provocative and boundary-pushing comics in the medium. He created the source material with artist Derek Robertson, and it ran for about 72 issues between 2006 and 2012. The comics are famously even more extreme than the television adaptation, which is saying quite a lot given how far the show already pushes things. The television version takes the skeleton of the comic, the broad characters, the central premise, the satirical heart of it, and then builds something new around that skeleton. It keeps the spirit alive while finding its own voice. The show is set in a world where a company called Vought International has essentially cornered the market on superheroes. They did not just stumble into this position. They built it deliberately and carefully over decades. Vought is not a government agency or a charity or even a defense contractor in the traditional sense. It is a media and pharmaceutical company first and a superhero management corporation second. Or maybe those two things are reversed. It is genuinely hard to tell sometimes, which is kind of the point. The superheroes in this world are called supes, and most of them got their abilities from a compound called Compound V, which Vought developed and controls. This detail matters enormously to the whole story because it means the existence of superheroes is not some cosmic accident or the result of alien radiation or a spider bite in a science lab. It is a business decision. Vought created them because Vought wanted them, and Vought maintains that monopoly on superhuman creation because it gives them extraordinary leverage over governments, militaries, corporations, and basically everyone else on the planet. Sleep on that thought for a moment. The idea that power is not just acquired but manufactured and then sold. The top team of superheroes in this world is called the Seven, which is obviously a reference to the number 7 but also plays on the idea of these grand teams of heroes you see in other comic universes. They live and work out of something called the Tower. They have action figures and breakfast cereals and streaming deals and everything else you would expect from celebrities of that magnitude. They are not really crime fighters in the traditional sense. They are intellectual properties. They are assets on a balance sheet. The actual heroics they do are mostly carefully staged, or at least carefully presented to make them look as good as possible regardless of what actually happened. The central character on the side of the heroes, if we are using that word loosely, is a man named Billy Butcher. He is a deeply complicated, frequently infuriating, and occasionally oddly touching character who operates the group known as the Boys. His motivation is personal in the most devastating way possible. His wife Becca had a connection to Homelander, the most powerful and most dangerous supe, and that connection destroyed his family. Butcher's entire mission is built around grief and rage, and the show is honest enough to admit that grief and rage make a person do things they should not do. He is not a clean hero. He is barely a hero at all in the conventional sense. But there is something about him that keeps you invested. Homelander himself is one of the genuinely remarkable villain creations in modern television. He is a Superman parody on the surface, same general look, same general power set, flying and laser vision and enormous physical strength. But where Superman is idealized goodness, Homelander is idealized goodness as a performance hiding something completely hollow underneath. He grew up without love, raised in a laboratory environment, tested and studied and never held or comforted or treated like a child rather than an experiment. And what that created is a person of almost limitless physical power and almost no genuine emotional foundation. He craves approval constantly. He needs people to love him. And when they do not, or when he suspects they do not, The response is terrifying. The actor who plays him is Anthony Starr, who is from New Zealand and was not particularly famous before this role. Watching him play Homelander is one of those experiences where you genuinely forget there is an actor doing work. He has this quality in the performance where the character can switch from warm and paternal to cold and menacing in a fraction of a second, and the transition is smooth enough that you are never quite sure which version is real. The answer the show eventually gives you is that neither version is entirely real, which is somehow more disturbing than either option on its own. The show is also quite deliberate about the way it uses its superhero aesthetics to talk about celebrity culture, corporate power, and the way media shapes what people believe about the world. The Vought News network in the show is an obvious parallel to certain real-world media organizations, and the way it manages the narratives around the superheroes mirrors the way public relations and media management work in practice. Nothing about the heroic image is accidental. Every appearance, every statement, every charity event is calibrated. One of the show's most interesting recurring threads is the way it handles religion and faith. As the series progresses, Vought begins exploring the idea of positioning Homelander not just as a celebrity or a hero but as something closer to a divine figure. The logic behind this is almost frighteningly straightforward once you hear it. If you can convince people that someone is not just powerful but holy, their loyalty becomes essentially unshakable. Criticism becomes not just wrong but sinful. And the person at the center of that devotion can do whatever they want because their authority is now framed as sacred rather than institutional. This is why the show is so layered even when it seems like it is just being shocking for its own sake. The shocking moments exist on the surface, but underneath them there is always an argument being made about something real. The question of how power maintains itself, how institutions protect themselves, how ordinary people get caught up in systems they did not design and sometimes cannot see clearly from inside. Annie January, who uses the name Starlight publicly, is another deeply interesting character. She arrived at the Seven with genuine idealism, actually believing in the heroic mission, and the show spent considerable time documenting the slow erosion of that idealism as she learned what the organization actually was. What makes her compelling is that she does not simply become cynical. She fights to hold on to something real even as everything around her tries to corrupt or dismiss it. Her relationship with Huey Campbell, the other major character on the side of the boys, is one of the emotional anchors of the whole series. Huey started the whole story as a relatively ordinary guy who got pulled into this world after a tragedy involving one of the Supes. He is fundamentally decent, which sounds like a small thing but is actually quite rare in this universe. He sometimes overcorrects and becomes too passive or too deferential, but the show keeps bringing him back to his own sense of right and wrong. His relationship with Annie is interesting partly because they represent two different approaches to the same question, which is how do you maintain your humanity inside systems designed to strip it away from you? The show also features a character called Mother's Milk, whose nickname has an unusual and very specific origin that the show explains. He is the moral center of the boys in many ways, more grounded and more consistent than Butcher, more experienced and more cautious than Huey. He has a complicated family life, and the tension between his responsibilities to that family and his responsibilities to the mission is something the show returns to repeatedly. He represents the cost that this kind of work extracts from a person over time. Frenchie and Kimiko are another pairing worth thinking about on a quiet night. Frenchie is a chemist and a weapons specialist with a chaotic past and a gift for unexpected warmth. Kimiko was a captive who had Compound V administered against her will and developed superhuman abilities as a result. She does not speak, which is a creative choice that forces the show to develop her character entirely through action and expression and her dynamic with Frenchie. Their relationship becomes one of the most genuinely tender things the show contains, which is a notable achievement given everything else happening around them. The Deep is a character who started as a simple parody of Aquaman but gradually became something more complicated as the series continued. He talks to marine animals, which is played for a mixture of comedy and pathos in equal measure. He is deeply insecure, frequently incompetent, and was pushed out of the Seven under circumstances the show handles with surprising seriousness. His attempts to rehabilitate his public image and find meaning take him through some genuinely strange places, and his relationship with the ocean creatures he interacts with becomes oddly moving. A-Train is another hero who began as a parody figure, a speedster whose whole brand is about being the fastest, but who gradually accumulated more complexity. Questions about performance enhancement, about what it costs to maintain superhuman performance long-term, about race and representation within the Vought system. The show uses his storyline to examine how institutions make promises about diversity and inclusion while actually doing the opposite of those things at every structural level. Queen Maeve is a Wonder Woman analog who appears to have everything but has been grinding herself down for years, maintaining a performance of heroism she no longer believes in. Her arc involves the exhaustion of pretending and the complicated possibility of stopping. Stillwell was a character who represented Vaught's corporate face, someone who understood exactly what the company was and managed it with cold efficiency. Her relationship with Homelander was one of the most psychologically unusual dynamics in the early seasons. The comic book origins of many characters are worth knowing about. In the comics, some characters have very different fates and motivations than their television counterparts. The show's creative team made deliberate choices about which elements to adapt directly and which to rethink entirely. In some cases, the television versions of characters are considerably more sympathetic than their source material counterparts. In other cases, the show intensifies certain qualities that the comics only sketched. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which doubles convincingly for various American cities. The production design is one of its quiet strengths. The Seven Tower has a very specific visual language, all gleaming surfaces and corporate aspirational architecture. The Boys' base of operations looks like the exact opposite, cramped and functional and chaotic. The contrast is doing real work in terms of establishing what each side of the conflict represents. The music choices in The Boys are consistently interesting. The show has a habit of placing extremely cheerful or romantically familiar songs against scenes of considerable violence or darkness, and this juxtaposition creates a specific tonal effect. It keeps you slightly off balance. It refuses to let the violence feel entirely heavy or entirely weightless. There is something about hearing an upbeat track during a moment of chaos that mirrors the way the show treats its corporate villains. Everything packaged pleasantly regardless of what it actually contains. One of the recurring themes of the show is about what happens to idealism when it encounters power. Almost every character in The Boys has some version of this arc. They believed in something, or they chose to believe in something, or they were sold something worth believing in, and then reality arrived. How each character processes that collision between belief and reality defines what they become. Some become cynical. Some become violent. Some find a way to hold on to something worth holding on to. The show does not always tell you which response is correct, and that ambiguity is part of what makes it interesting to think about. The satirical targets shift somewhat as the show progresses. Early on, it is primarily about celebrity culture and corporate behavior. As it continues, it broadens to include social media dynamics, political radicalization, the way media ecosystems create closed loops of belief, and the specific mechanics of how cults of personality form and grow. These themes are not subtle, but they are handled with enough specificity to feel genuinely observed rather than just reactive. The Compound V mythology expands considerably as the show progresses. We learn more about its history, where it came from, how it was developed, how it was used over decades before the show's present-day events. Some of this history involves experiments on soldiers without their knowledge or consent, which is one of the darker corners of the lore. The show uses this history to complicate the idea that the soup problem is recent or unprecedented. The roots of it go back much further than most people in the world of the show understand. Soldier Boy is a character introduced in the third season who represents a different era of Vaught's ambitions. He is presented as the original superhero, the first successful Compound V product, and his existence raises interesting questions about the mythology the company built. Jensen Ackles, who plays him, brings a specific quality to the role that plays interestingly against the other characters. The character's relationship to contemporary events is complicated by the fact that he is essentially a product of a completely different cultural moment who has been thrust into the present without adequate preparation. The Black Noir character has one of the more unusual trajectories in the show, involving questions of identity and what lies beneath the mask in both literal and figurative senses. The sage character, introduced in later seasons, is fascinating because she represents intelligence weaponized entirely in service of power. She is the smartest person in most rooms but has chosen to deploy that intelligence in ways that raise deep questions about what intelligence without ethics actually produces. The relationship between the boys and Vought is not simply one of good versus evil, though it sometimes appears that way on the surface. The boys operate outside the law, frequently cause collateral damage, make terrible decisions, and have genuine moral failures. Vought is clearly worse in most ways, but the show is interested in the question of whether fighting something makes you like it, whether the methods you choose contaminate the cause you are fighting for. This is not a show with clean heroes and dirty villains. The dirt is distributed fairly widely. As the series moves toward its later seasons, the stakes escalate in ways that feel earned by the groundwork laid earlier. The question of what would happen if someone with Homelander's power and psychological profile accumulated genuine political and religious authority becomes less hypothetical and more immediate. The show starts asking what the end of this story looks like, what the world on the other side of all of this conflict might be, whether anything can actually be fixed or whether certain things once broken stay broken. The show has developed an enormous following that engages with it on multiple levels simultaneously. Some people watch purely for the chaos and spectacle. Some watch for the satire and the commentary. Some watch for the character work and the emotional storylines. The show manages to deliver enough of each of these things to hold all of those audiences. The trick is that none of those layers undermines the others. The satire makes the spectacle more meaningful. The character work makes the satire feel human rather than abstract. The chaos makes the quieter moments land harder by contrast. There is something worth appreciating in the fact that a show this deliberately extreme is also one of the more thoughtfully constructed pieces of television currently being made. It knows what it is saying. It knows why it is saying it. And underneath all the loudness, there is a genuine investment in the question of what ordinary people are supposed to do when the systems they live inside turn out to be corrupt at every level. That question does not have an easy answer. The show knows it does not have an easy answer, but it keeps asking anyway. So as you drift off tonight, let that sit with you gently. A world of impossible powers and entirely human problems. Corporate towers with gleaming facades and rotting interiors. Characters trying to find something worth holding onto in the middle of everything falling apart. The Boys is loud and chaotic and frequently very funny and occasionally genuinely moving, and it is asking questions that do not go away just because the episode ends. Sleep well. The world will still be there in the morning. Superhero optional. The most unsettling superhero ever put on screen wasn't created by Marvel or DC. He was raised in a laboratory, never told he was loved, and given the power to destroy everything he touched. The Boys is a show that exists in this fascinating space between satire and genuine emotional storytelling. It takes everything you thought you knew about superheroes and flips it completely upside down. The premise sounds simple on the surface. What if the people with extraordinary powers were not the noble protectors we always imagined them to be? What if instead they were deeply flawed, psychologically damaged, and in some cases genuinely monstrous? What comes out of that question is one of the richest, most layered television universes ever constructed. Let's start with something that gets overlooked surprisingly often. The show draws heavily from a comic book series that came out in 2006. The original comics were written by Garth Ennis, who is known for being absolutely relentless when it comes to pushing boundaries. The television adaptation keeps the core spirit of that material alive, while also expanding and deepening certain storylines in ways that even fans of the comics found genuinely surprising. The showrunners made a deliberate choice early on to honor what made the source material so powerful, while also making it feel like something fresh and specifically designed for the world we live in right now. One of the most interesting things about the show's main villain, Homelander, is that his psychology is meticulously constructed. Every single thing about him, from his obsessive need for approval to his terrifying outbursts of violence, traces back to a very specific childhood that the show reveals gradually over multiple seasons. He was raised in a laboratory. He never had a parent in any meaningful sense. The people around him during his most formative years treated him as an asset rather than a child. That kind of deprivation creates something almost impossible to repair. The show takes that damage seriously, and what emerges is a character who simultaneously wants to be loved by absolutely everyone and also holds everyone in contempt. That contradiction is what makes him so fascinating to watch. The actor who plays Homelander has spoken in various interviews about how he approaches the role, and one thing that consistently comes up is the idea of playing someone who has no genuine emotional anchoring. Everything Homelander feels is exaggerated, performative, or completely disconnected from reality. When he smiles, it never quite reaches his eyes. When he laughs, there is something hollow underneath it. These are all deliberate choices, and they come through in a way that makes your skin crawl even during moments that should feel lighter. Now here is something truly interesting about the way the show handles its generational trauma theme, because this is one of the most carefully crafted threads running through the entire series. The show essentially argues that trauma does not just affect the person who experienced it. It gets passed down. It mutates. It becomes the lens through which damaged people see the world and eventually the template they use when interacting with others, especially the people closest to them. You see this most clearly in the relationships between fathers and sons. Each generation inherits something broken from the one before, and the tragedy is that even when characters are aware of this cycle, breaking it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. Soldier Boy is a character who embodies this idea perfectly. He is presented as a kind of Golden Age hero, the original American superhero, a product of the post-World War II era when America was deeply anxious about its standing in the world and desperately wanted its own myths and legends. The show is very specific about how this character came to exist. After the war, there was this enormous appetite for symbols of American strength and superiority, and a character like Soldier Boy fit perfectly into that cultural moment. He was strong, conventionally handsome in that mid-century movie star way, and he projected an image of uncomplicated patriotic power. But behind that image was someone who carried their own wounds. The show makes clear that Soldier Boy himself had a brutal upbringing, complete with a father who was abusive and cruel. He learned what relationships looked like from someone who treated love as a weapon. And so when he eventually had a son of his own, which he did not even know about for most of his existence, he had no template for anything other than what he had been taught. The cycle continued. Homelander grew up without Soldier Boy, yes, but he still inherited that damage through other means, through the clinical coldness of the laboratory, through the manipulative warmth of people who only cared about controlling him. And then there is Ryan, Homelander's actual biological son, a young boy navigating an almost unimaginably complicated situation. He loves his father. Children often love their parents regardless of what those parents have done, because love and safety feel like the same thing when you are young. But Ryan is also perceptive enough to sense that something is deeply wrong. The show handles this character with real tenderness. He is not simply a prop in the larger story. He is a person trying to figure out who he is while surrounded by adults who all have their own agendas and their own damage. One of the most poignant things about Ryan's storyline in the later seasons is the moment when he discovers that things he believed to be true about his family were not true at all. When a child discovers that the story they were told about their own origins was a lie, something fundamental shifts inside them. The ground under their feet is no longer solid. This is something that real survivors of family dysfunction talk about all the time. The rewriting of your own history is sometimes more traumatic than the original wound, because it means you have to question not just what happened but what you understood about your own life. Now let's talk about the broader world of the show, because one of its most brilliant achievements is the way it constructs the infrastructure of this universe. Vought International is not just a company. It is a stand-in for every massive corporation that has ever wrapped itself in idealistic language while pursuing fundamentally self-interested goals. The show understands that the most dangerous villains are not the ones who openly announce their cruelty. The most dangerous villains are the ones who have convinced themselves and everyone around them that they are actually the good guys. The character of Stan Edgar is one of the show's most sophisticated creations for exactly this reason. He is not loud. He is not theatrical. He does not give monologues about domination or victory. He is simply a man who understands how power works at a structural level, and he uses that understanding with cold precision. When he says that corporations are the true villains, more dangerous than any individual with superpowers, he is not being ironic. He genuinely believes this because he has spent decades operating within that system and watching it produce results that individual violence never could. There is a speech in the later season that captures something genuinely important about how systems of power perpetuate themselves. The argument goes something like this. You can remove a person from power. You can expose them. You can even destroy them. But the structure that made them powerful, the institutions, the money, the cultural mythology built around their image, that structure persists. It finds a new vessel. It adapts. This is not a cynical or hopeless observation. It is actually a call to think about change at a deeper level, to address the roots rather than just the visible branches. The science fiction elements of the show, particularly the substance called Compound V, are used to explore questions about pharmaceutical power, about what happens when profit and human experimentation intersect without sufficient oversight. The show draws explicit parallels to real historical atrocities, moments when human beings were treated as experimental subjects by institutions that had convinced themselves the ends justified the means. These are not comfortable parallels, and they are not meant to be. Friedrich Vought, the fictional scientist whose legacy haunts the entire show, is clearly modeled on the very real phenomenon of Nazi scientists who were recruited by the United States government after World War II through a program historically known as Operation Paperclip. The show does not shy away from what this means. If the foundation of your entire superhero industry was built on atrocity, if the very substance that creates these powerful beings was developed through the torture and murder of innocent people, then everything built on top of that foundation carries that weight. Every superhero in the show, whether they know it or not, is connected to that original violence. One of the recurring visual and thematic motifs of the show is the contrast between what things look like on the surface and what they actually are underneath. The Seven, the show's central superhero team, exists primarily as a marketing product. Their public appearances are managed by publicists. Their relationships are manufactured for media consumption. Their personalities are packaged and sold. The show draws this out in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar given how celebrity culture actually functions in the real world. Starlight is interesting precisely because she starts out genuinely believing in the mission. She grew up with authentic faith in superheroes as symbols of hope and protection. When she discovers what the reality of being a corporate superhero actually looks like, the disillusionment she experiences is written all over her face in every scene. She does not immediately become cynical. She does not flip into pure pragmatism. She struggles. She tries to reconcile what she believed with what she is learning. That struggle is one of the most human things in the show. Huey, her partner, has his own version of this journey. He enters the story as someone who has experienced the direct violence of superhero recklessness, someone who lost someone he loved to a casual accident that a superhero did not even bother to pause for. His anger is righteous. His desire for accountability is completely understandable. But the show is also honest about how anger, even righteous anger, can become its own kind of trap if you are not careful with it. Huey spends much of the series learning to be dangerous without becoming what he hates. Butcher is probably the most complicated character in the show's ensemble. He has all the qualities that genre fiction likes to give its anti-heroes. He is ruthless and intelligent. He is capable of extraordinary violence when the situation demands it. He is also genuinely committed to a cause he believes in deeply. But the show refuses to let him be simply cool or simply tragic. It insists on showing you the actual cost of the choices he makes. When Butcher hurts someone, when he lies or manipulates or destroys something in the service of his mission, there are consequences that ripple outward. People suffer. Trust is broken. The people who believed in him have to decide what to do with that information. His relationship with Ryan is one of the most emotionally loaded in the entire series. On one level, Butcher sees Ryan as a threat, as a potential Homelander in the making, a child with devastating power and uncertain moral development. On another level, Ryan represents something Butcher has lost and can never recover. There is a complicated protective instinct that lives inside his hostility, and the show gives you enough glimpses of it to understand that even this most guarded and destructive character carries something tender underneath all the damage. The world building in the show extends into some genuinely fascinating territory when it explores the religious dimension of superhero worship. There is something the show keeps circling back to, which is the idea that in a world where people with godlike power actually exist and are publicly visible, the human impulse toward religious devotion does not disappear. It just finds a new object. Homelander understands this on some instinctive level, and in the later seasons he begins actively cultivating it. He does not just want to be admired. He wants to be worshipped. He wants the kind of unconditional devotion that does not ask questions, that does not require accountability, that simply surrenders. The show makes this critique of authoritarian movements very carefully and very specifically. The rallies, the iconography, the way dissent is treated as betrayal, the way followers are encouraged to define themselves entirely in opposition to imagined enemies. These are not abstract warnings. They are drawn from very specific historical and contemporary sources. The writers have been thoughtful about not making this a partisan thing in the simplest sense. The critique is broader than that. It is about how charismatic authority figures exploit the genuine human need for belonging and meaning. The Deep is one of the show's most unexpected emotional landscapes. He starts out as a figure of somewhat grotesque satire, a powerful figure who abuses his position and then faces consequences he considers unfair. But somewhere along the way, the show found something genuinely pathetic and almost sympathetic in him. He is someone who has never developed any meaningful inner life. He defines himself entirely through status and through what others think of him. When that external validation is taken away, there is nothing underneath. No actual self to fall back on. His relationship with aquatic life becomes the one place where he experiences something close to genuine feeling, and the show plays this for dark comedy while also letting it be genuinely sad. Mother's Milk is the character who perhaps best represents the show's argument about how ordinary people find the courage to resist systems that feel too large and too powerful to challenge. He is not someone who wants to be a hero. He has a family he loves. He has a normal life that he wants to return to. But he also has a history with Vought that made turning away impossible. His commitment is not abstract. It is not ideological in the airy sense. It is personal and specific and rooted in actual loss. That is what makes him believable as someone who keeps going even when the situation seems completely hopeless. Frenchie and Kimiko as a pair explore something the show does surprisingly tenderly, which is the question of what a meaningful life looks like for people who have been shaped by violence. Kimiko was turned into a weapon. She did not choose her power. She did not choose the world she was pulled into. What she wants, with a clarity that cuts right through all the chaos around her, is something quiet. She wants connection. She wants a future that belongs to her rather than to the emergency she was drafted into. Whether or not she gets that future is something the show holds in careful suspension. The spin-off elements that the show has begun to develop point toward an even more elaborate universe, one that stretches back through decades of American history. The idea of exploring the origins of Vought in the post-war period, of seeing how the superhero mythology was constructed from the ground up during the Cold War era of anxiety and ambition, is genuinely exciting from a storytelling perspective. The show has always been interested in history, in how the present is shaped by things that happened before any of the current characters were born. Expanding backward into that territory gives the mythology more texture and more weight. One of the most technically impressive things about the show is how it manages tonal shifts. In a single episode, you can move from something absolutely grotesque and shocking to something quietly heartbreaking to something genuinely funny and then back again. This should not work. Shows that try to cover that much tonal ground usually end up feeling incoherent or manipulative. But the writing and direction maintain such clear control of the emotional logic that each shift feels earned rather than jarring. You understand why this moment follows that moment even when the surface texture feels completely different. The music choices throughout the series deserve their own mention. There is a particular joy in how the show places classic rock and pop songs in completely unexpected contexts, letting the familiar sounds of beloved music become strange and sometimes sinister when attached to images that recontextualize them entirely. This is a technique with a long history in film and television, but the show uses it with particular wit and precision. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the idea at the heart of all of this storytelling. Power does not corrupt in a simple mechanical way. What power does is reveal. It takes what is already inside a person and removes the normal social pressures that keep it hidden. The kindness that a genuinely kind person carries comes out more freely when they have power. The cruelty that a cruel person has been managing comes out too. The world the show builds is not a world where extraordinary people are simply bad. It is a world where extraordinary power applied to ordinary human damage produces consequences that ordinary human communities struggle to contain. The most hopeful thing about it is that even in that world, people keep trying. They keep reaching toward each other. They keep believing that something better is possible. And that, in the end, is worth dreaming about. The show that made superheroes terrifying is ending, and the secrets buried inside Season 5 are almost too wild to say out loud. The Boys has been building toward this moment for years. Season 5 was announced as the final season of the show, meaning everything the writers, producers, cast, and crew have been constructing since the very beginning was always pointing toward this conclusion. That weight is hard to overstate. When a show knows it is ending, the energy around it changes entirely. The desperation to tie things together properly, to honor what came before, to go out on a high note rather than fizzle away like so many shows before it. That pressure shapes every single decision made in the writing room, on set, and in the editing bay. And from everything that has come out about Season 5, that pressure was very much felt by everyone involved. Let us start with something that might surprise you if you have been following the show casually. The Boys is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comic ran from 2006 to 2012, and it was genuinely one of the most provocative, boundary-pushing pieces of comic book storytelling ever published. But here is the thing that makes the show fascinating from a creative standpoint. The television adaptation does not follow the comic closely. It uses the comic as a launching pad, a source of tone and certain characters and some plot threads, but the show has branched off dramatically in its own direction. This means that even readers of the original comics were watching Season 5 without knowing exactly how things would end. The show carved out its own mythology, its own version of these characters, and its own conclusion that does not simply mirror what the comics did. That creative independence is genuinely rare, and it is one of the reasons the show has felt so alive and unpredictable. Now, as you settle in a little deeper, let me tell you something about the production scale of Season 5 that is worth appreciating. The Boys is one of the most expensive television productions in Amazon Prime Video's history. The visual effects work alone is staggering. Every season has pushed the boundaries of what streaming television can accomplish visually, and Season 5 was described by those involved as the most ambitious in terms of scope and scale. The final season needed to deliver on years of storytelling, which meant the action sequences, the world-building moments, and the character payoffs all had to feel larger than anything that came before. That is a significant undertaking. The crew behind the scenes, the visual effects artists, the stunt coordinators, the costume designers, all of them were working toward creating something that would feel like a proper cinematic finale rather than just another television episode. One of the most interesting things about The Boys as a show is what it actually represents beneath all the violence and the satire. At its core, the show has always been a story about power. Specifically, about what happens when power goes completely unchecked. Homelander, the show's central villain played with absolutely terrifying commitment by Anthony Starr, is not just a bad superhero. He is a portrait of narcissism, trauma, and the catastrophic consequences of giving someone with unresolved psychological damage complete and unlimited power. Season 5 had to reckon with what that character arc ultimately meant. Where does someone like Homelander end up? What does the world look like if he wins? What does it look like if he loses? These are not simple questions, and the show has never offered simple answers. Anthony Starr's performance across the entire run of The Boys has been one of television's great acting achievements. The way he plays Homelander, with this terrifying combination of desperate neediness and volcanic rage, is genuinely unsettling. In interviews leading up to Season 5, Starr spoke about the emotional toll of inhabiting this character, about the difficulty of finding the final note for someone this complex. He wanted to make sure the ending felt honest to who Homelander had always been rather than convenient or tidy. That kind of investment from a lead actor in the final stretch of a show makes a real difference to the quality of the finished product. Let your mind wander a little here. Think about the world of The Boys for a moment. It is a world where superheroes are not government-operated. They are corporate products, managed, marketed, and monetized by a massive conglomerate called Vought International. The genius of this concept is how it mirrors real-world conversations about celebrity, corporate power, and the commodification of heroism. The show is not subtle about its satirical targets. It has taken aim at media companies, political movements, celebrity culture, and the ways in which the public can be manipulated through carefully crafted narratives. Season 5 pushed these themes further than any previous season, with the political landscape of the show's world mirroring real-world tensions in ways that made some viewers genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. Here is a fact that might keep your curiosity ticking just long enough before sleep takes over. The character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty, underwent one of the most significant character evolutions in the show's history. When we first met Annie January in Season 1, she was an idealistic young woman genuinely excited about becoming a superhero. By Season 5, she had been through experiences that would have broken most people. What the writers did with her journey was track how someone maintains their fundamental goodness under impossible pressure. Moriarty has spoken about how physically and emotionally demanding the later seasons were, and how the final season required her to dig into emotional territory she had never accessed in previous years. The relationship between Starlight and Butcher, these two people from completely different worlds who end up needing each other in unexpected ways, became one of the emotional cores of the finale. Speaking of Billy Butcher, Carl Urban's portrayal of this character has been another one of the show's great accomplishments. Butcher begins the show as something close to a straightforward anti-hero, a man with a mission, brutal methods, and a reason that feels somewhat sympathetic. But as the show progressed, the cracks in his character deepened, and the show began asking harder questions about whether Butcher was actually the good guy he believed himself to be. Season 5 had to answer those questions definitively. Urban has talked in interviews about how he wanted the final season to honor all the complexity that had been built into this character without giving him an easy redemption or an unearned fall. The nuance required for that kind of performance is considerable. Now let us drift into some behind-the-scenes territory that is genuinely fascinating. Eric Kripke, the showrunner of The Boys, is the creative force at the center of everything. He spent years working on the adaptation, developing it from a relatively straightforward pitch into something much more politically charged and thematically ambitious. Kripke has been very vocal about wanting the show to feel genuinely dangerous, to push into territory that makes audiences question their own assumptions. In the lead-up to Season 5, he described the writer's room process as the most intense of the entire series, with debates about where characters needed to end up that sometimes got genuinely heated. That collaborative tension is often what produces the most interesting creative outcomes. One of the things that makes The Boys unique in the television landscape is its willingness to destroy characters that audiences have invested in. The show has never been precious about its cast. Major characters have been killed off in shocking ways throughout the run, and Season 5 was not going to break that tradition. The unpredictability of the show is one of its greatest assets because it means viewers can never fully relax. Even in your most comfortable sleep-adjacent state, your brain is probably somewhere in the back registering the fact that nobody on this show is truly safe. That tension is deliberately maintained by the writers as a tool to keep audiences engaged and to give the story genuine stakes. Let me tell you something about the music of The Boys that does not get discussed enough. The show has always used music in a deeply intentional way. The soundtrack choices, often popular songs deployed in moments of extreme violence or emotional irony, are a signature element of the show's aesthetic language. The music department for Season 5 had a significant task in front of them. How do you choose songs for the final chapter that feel like a culmination of the show's musical identity while also serving the specific emotional needs of each scene? The team behind the music, working alongside the directors, spent considerable time making those decisions. The result is a final season where the music feels both familiar in its approach and fresh in its specific selections. There is something worth knowing about the physical production of The Boys that is easy to overlook when you are watching it from your couch or your bed. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, though it regularly creates the impression of being set across the United States and beyond. The production design team builds environments of extraordinary detail. The Vought Tower interiors, the suburban neighborhoods, the underground spaces where the boys operate, all of these are constructed with a level of care that makes them feel lived in rather than like television sets. That groundedness is part of what makes the fantastical elements of the show land so effectively. When something impossible happens in a space that feels completely real, the impact is significantly greater. As you let yourself sink a little deeper into that comfortable state between awake and asleep, here is something to turn over in your mind. The Boys, particularly in its final season, was dealing with questions about legacy. What does it mean to fight against something enormous and corrupt? Does it matter if you win or lose? Can one person or one small group actually change the systems that seem too large to touch? These are not questions unique to a fictional world. They resonate because they are questions people genuinely grapple with when they look at institutions and power structures that feel immovable. The show never pretends to have easy answers, and that intellectual honesty is part of what has made it matter to so many people. The relationship between The Boys and its audience is genuinely interesting from a sociological standpoint. The show has attracted a fan base that is extraordinarily passionate, but it has also attracted attention from people who perhaps missed some of the satire and interpreted certain characters as aspirational rather than cautionary. This is something Kripke and the cast have addressed publicly on multiple occasions, particularly around the character of Homelander. The writers had to be mindful in Season 5 of how they were closing out this character's story in a way that was unambiguous about the show's moral position without becoming preachy or simplistic. That is a genuinely difficult creative challenge, and how they navigated it is one of the more discussed aspects of the final season. Let your breathing slow down a little. Let the details of the day drift back. We are going to keep moving through these fascinating layers of a show that has meant a lot to a lot of people. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of the best assembled groups in streaming television history. Beyond the leads, the supporting players have been essential to the show's texture. Characters like Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and Kamiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, provided the show with emotional counterweights to some of its heavier material. Their relationship across the entire run became one of the most genuinely touching elements of a show that is not exactly known for being gentle. Season 5 had to find the right conclusion for them as well, and the care taken with their arc in the final season reflects how seriously the writers took every thread in this story. There is something worth mentioning about the guest cast and special appearances that Season 5 featured. One of the joys of a show like The Boys is the way it occasionally pulls in surprising names for limited appearances, often deploying them in ways that are simultaneously unexpected and completely logical given the show's satire-driven world. The final season used this approach strategically, bringing in faces that felt significant in the context of what the show was saying about celebrity and power rather than just as stunt casting for its own sake. Here is something genuinely fascinating about the writing process for Season 5. The writers' room for the final season reportedly knew from very early in the process which character deaths were coming, which relationships would resolve, and what the final image of the show would be. Working backward from a known ending is a different creative experience than building a season with the destination still uncertain. It allowed the writers to plant seeds and establish patterns that would pay off in specific ways, creating a season that felt architecturally coherent from beginning to end rather than making things up as they went. That structural intentionality is evident in retrospect when you look at how storylines that seemed disconnected early in the season ultimately converged. The visual language of Season 5 represented an evolution of the show's aesthetic approach. The directors brought in for the final season worked closely with cinematographer to develop a look that felt slightly different from previous years, signaling that this chapter was something distinct. There is a quality to the lighting choices and camera movement in the final season that feels heavier, more deliberate, as if the world itself knows that something conclusive is coming. These are the kinds of craft decisions that audiences often feel without being able to articulate why a scene hits differently than expected. Let us talk about something that has been a consistent strength of the show from the very beginning. The Boys has always done exceptional work with its female characters. In a genre that has historically not prioritized the depth and complexity of its women, The Boys gave its female characters genuine agency, genuine flaws, genuine contradictions. Queen Maeve, played by Dominique McElligott, had one of the show's most interesting arcs in earlier seasons. The show has not been content to let female characters exist primarily in relation to male ones. They have their own drives, their own histories, their own failures and triumphs. Season 5 continued this commitment to complexity, giving its women material that was as rich and challenging as anything given to the male leads. There is a fascinating parallel that runs through the final season between individual psychology and institutional corruption. The show has always understood that systems do not become corrupt on their own. They are corrupted by people, by specific choices made by specific individuals who have the power to do differently. Season 5 traced this connection with particular precision, showing how the personal wounds and unresolved traumas of specific characters rippled outward into consequences affecting millions of people in this fictional world. That psychological framework for understanding systemic problems is actually quite sophisticated and represents some of the show's best thematic work. As you let yourself get even more comfortable, think about this. The Boys managed something that very few shows in the superhero genre have achieved. It made you feel the weight of superpowers as something terrifying rather than aspirational. In most superhero stories, powers are gifts. Things to be celebrated and deployed heroically. The Boys reframe them as something closer to a curse, or more accurately, as an amplification of whatever the person already was. Give someone with empathy and good judgment enormous power, and they might do genuinely good things. Give someone with unresolved trauma and narcissistic tendencies that same power, and you get Homelander. Season 5 pushed this idea to its logical conclusion, examining what it finally takes to address something that powerful and that dangerous when the normal mechanisms of accountability have completely broken down. The production crew behind the scenes in Season 5 reached numbers that rivaled major feature film productions. The coordination required to bring a season of this complexity to life involves hundreds of people across departments that audiences rarely think about. The props department alone had to manage an enormous inventory of items specific to this world. The art department had to maintain consistency across a fictional universe that has developed significant internal detail over 5 seasons. The wardrobe team had to manage character looks that had evolved across years while also introducing new visual elements appropriate for the final chapter. All of this invisible work accumulates into the experience of watching an episode and simply believing the world on screen. Here is something that sits at the interesting intersection of fiction and reality that The Boys has always played with. The show frequently references and parodies real-world media culture, political rhetoric, and corporate behavior in ways that are deliberately close to actual events. The writer's room reportedly has a practice of constantly monitoring real-world developments and asking how they can be incorporated or reflected in the story they are telling. This gives the show a quality of immediacy and relevance that many genre shows lack. By Season 5, the political landscape of both the show's world and the real world had become so intertwined that watching certain scenes felt startlingly pointed. Let your mind drift with this next one. There is a character in The Boys named Black Noir who has gone through one of the stranger and more interesting journeys in the show's history. The character's arc across the seasons, including revelations about their nature and identity, reflects the show's willingness to completely subvert audience expectations and then do something genuinely unexpected with the material that emerges from that subversion. Season 5 had to find a meaningful place for the legacy of this character within the larger resolution of the story. The Boys has been consistently praised by critics not just for its entertainment value but for what it represents as a piece of cultural commentary. Television critics who might otherwise be dismissive of superhero content have written seriously about what the show is doing and why it matters. This critical respect has shaped the show's production in interesting ways. When a creative team knows that thoughtful people are paying close attention to what they are saying and how they are saying it, there is an additional layer of accountability that influences decisions. The writers of Season 5 were very much aware that the ending of this show would be analyzed and discussed in depth, and that awareness shaped the ambition of what they attempted. Something worth knowing about the actors as a group is how much they genuinely seem to enjoy each other's company and how that chemistry translates to the screen. The ensemble energy of the boys is not manufactured. The cast has spoken across many interviews about the friendships they have developed over the course of the show and about how working together on the final season carried a genuine emotional weight because they all knew it was coming to an end. That bittersweet awareness of finishing something meaningful permeates the performances in Season 5 in ways that are difficult to quantify but absolutely present. The humor of the boys is one of its most discussed and most divisive elements. The show is genuinely funny, often in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. It uses comedy as a pressure release valve, deploying absurdist or darkly comic moments within sequences of extreme tension in order to manage audience experience in a specific way. Season 5 maintained this balancing act even as the stakes reached their highest point. The ability to be genuinely funny within a story that is also asking serious questions is one of the rarer creative skills, and the writers of The Boys have demonstrated it consistently. There is a quieter element of the show that sometimes gets overshadowed by the more explosive content. The Boys has always found time for small, intimate character moments that exist outside the main plot machinery. Conversations between characters about their fears, their regrets, their hopes for things they believe they do not deserve. These moments, often just two people talking in an unglamorous setting, are where the show does some of its most affecting work. Season 5 included a number of these quieter scenes that longtime fans have pointed to as among the most emotionally resonant in the entire series. Your breathing is probably slower now. Good. Keep going with me just a little longer because there is more worth knowing. The relationship between the boys and the superhero genre more broadly is worth reflecting on. The show arrived at a moment when superhero content was reaching a kind of saturation point in popular culture. Rather than adding to that saturation, it offered a fundamentally different perspective on the genre's assumptions and conventions. It asked what superheroes would actually look like if the world they operated in was recognizably like our own, with the same power dynamics, the same corruption, the same gap between stated values and actual behavior. Season 5 brought this interrogation of the genre to its most pointed and definitive expression. Garth Ennis, the creator of the original comic, has been publicly appreciative of what the television adaptation has done with his source material, even where it diverged significantly. This relationship between original creator and adaptation team is not always harmonious, and the fact that Ennis has expressed genuine enthusiasm for the show speaks to the respect with which the television creators approached the spirit of what he originally created even when they departed from a letter of it. Something to sleep on. The legacy of The Boys as a show will likely be discussed for many years. It arrived at a specific cultural moment and responded to it with genuine creative ambition and moral seriousness. The final season was the opportunity to cement that legacy or undermine it, and by most accounts from both critics and fans, what was delivered in Season 5 was worthy of everything that came before it. Whether you agree with its conclusions, whether you found its resolution satisfying or challenging, the show earned the conversation it prompted. The technical achievement of the visual effects in Season 5 deserves a final mention. The artists and technical teams who created the visual language of this world worked across the entire production timeline, from pre-production design through principal photography and into the long post-production period. Some of the more elaborate sequences in the final season involved effects work that was in development for over a year before the episodes aired. The invisible craft required to make the impossible look ordinary is something that audiences experience as effortless when it works properly, which means the people responsible for it only get noticed when something goes wrong. In Season 5, very little went wrong. The Boys gave us something rare in popular entertainment. A story with genuine moral stakes, characters who were allowed to be genuinely complicated, and a willingness to follow its own logic even when that meant going to uncomfortable places. Season 5 was the conclusion of that promise, the delivery of everything the show had been building toward across years and hundreds of thousands of words of storytelling. And that is a good thought to carry you gently toward sleep tonight. All those years of work, all those people, all those decisions made in rooms you will never see, by people whose names scroll past in credits that go by too fast to read. All of it adding up to something that you watched in the dark, that made you feel things, that gave you something to think about. The world of The Boys is a dark one. But the fact that stories like this get made and watched and talked about says something quietly hopeful about the people who make them and the people who love them. There is something human in wanting to look at power clearly, to refuse to dress it up in a cape and call it good, to insist on asking harder questions even when easier answers are available. So as your thoughts slow down and the details of this fictional world begin to blur at the edges and blend with whatever images your sleeping mind is starting to assemble, just know that you spent this time in good company. With a story that tried to be honest about difficult things. With characters who were messy and human even when they could fly or punch through walls. With a show that knew it was ending and tried to end with integrity. Let the sounds around you fade. Let the weight of everything you carry today get a little lighter. The Boys Season 5 has come and gone, and it left a mark. And now, it is time to rest. Sleep well. What if I told you that one of the most disturbing television shows ever made is actually perfect to fall asleep to? Yeah, I know that sounds completely backwards. The Boys, Amazon Prime's brutally honest superhero satire, just dropped its 4th season, and whether you've watched every episode wide awake or you're someone who loves drifting off to the sound of interesting facts and behind-the-scenes details, you are in exactly the right place tonight. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and let me walk you through some of the most fascinating things about the Boys season for that even hardcore fans might not know. We are going deep on the creative choices, the real-world inspirations, the actor experiences, and the little details hidden in plain sight throughout the season. No jump scares, no sudden loud moments, just a calm and thorough journey through one of the most ambitious seasons of television in recent memory. The Boys Season 4 arrived on Prime Video in June of 2024, and from the very first episode it made clear that showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had no intention of pulling any punches. The season picks up in the aftermath of the events of Season 3, with the political and social landscape of the show's universe feeling more relevant and more uncomfortably close to our own reality than ever before. That sense of uncomfortable familiarity is something the creative team has always leaned into, but Season 4 took it to an entirely different level, drawing from headlines, political movements, and cultural anxieties in ways that sparked massive conversations online. One of the most talked about aspects of Season 4 was the character of Homelander, played with terrifying brilliance by Anthony Starr. What many viewers don't realize is how much physical and psychological preparation Anthony Starr puts into each season of this show. For Season 4, Starr has spoken in interviews about the challenge of portraying a character who is simultaneously becoming more unhinged and more powerful. The writing team gave Homelander storylines that pushed the character's narcissism and need for validation to completely new extremes, and Starr had to find ways to make those moments feel authentic rather than cartoonish. The result was a performance that earned enormous critical praise, with many reviewers calling it the best work Starr has done across the entire series. Now here is something genuinely interesting about how the show handles its villain. Kripke and the writers have been very open about the fact that Homelander is deliberately designed to mirror certain real-world figures without being a direct one-to-one copy of any specific person. The goal, as the creative team has explained it, is to capture something more universal about the psychology of unchecked power, about what happens when someone with enormous capabilities is never held accountable and is constantly surrounded by people who either fear them or worship them. That psychological portrait is researched carefully, and the writers have consulted materials on authoritarian personality types, cult dynamics, and the psychology of celebrity to shape how Homelander behaves in Season 4. Speaking of research, the production team for The Boys is known for doing extraordinary amounts of homework before every season. For Season 4, the writers' room reportedly spent months studying political movements, media manipulation tactics, and corporate lobbying practices to ensure the satirical elements of the show felt grounded and specific rather than vague. This is part of why the show resonates so deeply with audiences. It is not just throwing wild ideas at the wall. Every exaggerated moment in The Boys tends to have a real-world anchor point that makes it hit harder than pure fantasy ever could. Let us talk for a moment about the production design of Season 4, because it is genuinely remarkable and not enough people discuss it. The visual world of The Boys has always been meticulously constructed to feel like our world with the volume turned up slightly. In Season 4, the design team put enormous effort into the Vought Corporation's aesthetic, expanding and deepening the visual language of what is essentially the show's central villain organization. The way Vought spaces are designed tells you everything you need to know about how the corporation sees itself. Clean, powerful, aspirational. All chrome and glass and American flags. It is visual propaganda built into architecture, and the production designers made very deliberate choices about every space Vought characters inhabit. The Seven, Vaught's flagship superhero team, got some significant changes in Season 4, and the costume and makeup departments had their hands full keeping up with the evolving nature of each character. The superhero suits in The Boys are not spandex and foam rubber. They are incredibly intricate garments made from high-quality materials that have to be both visually impressive on camera and functional enough for the actors to actually move in. Each suit reportedly takes weeks to construct and thousands of dollars worth of materials. When characters get new suit variations or when suits need to show damage and wear, the costume team essentially has to build entirely new pieces rather than simply modifying existing ones. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, had one of the most dramatically complex arcs of Season 4, and Urban has talked publicly about how much he enjoys the challenge this character presents. Butcher is a character defined by contradiction. He is brutal and manipulative and genuinely dangerous, but there is also something deeply wounded and human at his core, and Urban works hard to keep both of those things visible simultaneously. For Season 4 in particular, the writing gave Butcher storylines dealing with mortality and legacy that required Urban to bring genuine emotional weight to scenes that could easily have felt melodramatic in less skilled hands. It is the kind of writing and performance combination that elevates genre television into something that genuinely matters. Here is a detail many casual viewers miss. The Boys is actually an adaptation of a comic book series created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, published by Wildstorm and later Dynamite Entertainment between 2006 and 2012. The show has always taken significant liberties with its source material, expanding, changing, and sometimes entirely reimagining characters and storylines. By Season 4, the television version has diverged so substantially from the comics that viewers who have read the original source material are often just as surprised by plot developments as those who have never picked up a single issue. This is a conscious choice by the showrunners, who wanted the series to be its own living thing rather than simply a faithful adaptation. The relationship between the comic and the show is actually a fascinating study in how source material can be honored in spirit, while being radically transformed in execution. Garth Ennis, the original comics writer, has been publicly supportive of the television adaptation even though it takes the story in very different directions. Part of what makes this interesting is that Ennis himself was writing a satirical critique of superhero culture, corporate power, and American exceptionalism back in the mid-2000s, and Kripke's team has found ways to update those themes for a very different cultural moment while keeping the core provocative energy of the original work intact. Now let us drift into something a little more technical and perhaps more soothing to think about. The visual effects work on The Boys Season 4 is staggering in its scale and ambition. This is a show that requires hundreds of individual visual effects shots per episode, everything from the relatively simple removal of wires and harnesses when actors appear to be flying, to extraordinarily complex sequences involving superpowers being used in violent and creative ways. The VFX team on The Boys has grown substantially with each season as the show's ambitions have expanded, and Season 4 reportedly had one of the largest visual effects budgets of any streaming show in 2024. One of the most technically challenging aspects of the visual effects work involves scenes where multiple super-powered characters interact with each other and with environments simultaneously. Coordinating those sequences requires incredibly detailed pre-visualization work, where the entire sequence is essentially mapped out in a rough digital format before filming even begins. This previs process can take weeks or even months for particularly complex sequences, and it involves close collaboration between the directors, the stunt coordinators, the VFX supervisors, and the actors themselves. By the time a major action sequence actually gets filmed, everyone involved has essentially rehearsed it dozens of times in various forms. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most nuanced roles in Season 4. Her character has been on an extraordinary journey across the series, moving from naive idealism to hard-won cynicism to something more complicated and interesting than either of those things. Moriarty has spoken about the responsibility she feels toward this character, particularly because Annie resonates so strongly with young women in the audience who see their own experiences with disillusionment and resilience reflected in her story. Season 4 gave Moriarty material that explored new dimensions of Annie's character, and she has been clear in interviews that the collaborative atmosphere on set is a significant part of what makes those performances possible. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of its greatest strengths, and Season 4 made excellent use of the established chemistry between these performers. Shows that have been running for multiple seasons sometimes struggle to keep ensemble dynamics feeling fresh, but The Boys has consistently managed to find new combinations of characters to put in scenes together, which keeps the interpersonal dynamics from going stale. Some of the most compelling moments in Season 4 come from unexpected pairings of characters who do not often share screen time, and those moments tend to generate some of the most memorable performances of the season. Let us talk about the music for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the show's secret weapons. The Boys has always had a masterful approach to music supervision, selecting needle drops that create ironic contrast between what is being shown on screen and what is being heard on the soundtrack. Season 4 continued this tradition with some genuinely inspired choices that viewers have endlessly discussed and debated online. The selection of songs is never random. Each piece of music is chosen to add a layer of commentary to whatever scene it accompanies, and the music supervisors work closely with the directors and the showrunner to ensure that the tonal balance between horror and dark comedy is maintained throughout. The original score of the show is also worth appreciating separately from the licensed music. The composer who works on The Boys has developed a distinctive sonic palette for the series over its run, and that score is subtler than the attention-grabbing needle drops but just as carefully crafted. The orchestral and electronic elements of the score work to create a sense of unease that runs beneath even the show's lighter moments, reminding viewers that this is fundamentally a dark world even when things appear to be going well for the characters. Here is something interesting about how Season 4 was written. The writer's room for The Boys is known for being a particularly creative and collaborative space, but it is also an intense one. Kripke has described the process of breaking stories for each season as involving enormous amounts of debate, with writers pushing each other to go further and be more specific in their critiques and their character work. For Season 4, some story ideas were apparently discussed for weeks before being either refined into something that made it to screen or set aside entirely. The ideas that get cut are often just as wild as the ones that end up in the show, which gives you some sense of the creative ambition at work in that room. The political satire in Season 4 was particularly pointed, and this generated a fascinating cultural phenomenon where people across the political spectrum simultaneously claimed the show was critiquing the other side. This is actually a testament to the sophistication of the writing. The show manages to create a funhouse mirror version of contemporary politics that reflects genuinely troubling dynamics in ways that feel recognizable without being so specifically partisan that they alienate half the audience immediately. Kripke has talked about this balance in numerous interviews, describing it as one of the ongoing creative challenges of making the show. Now, as you settle in and let your breathing slow down a little, let me tell you about the filming locations for Season 4. The Boys is primarily filmed in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for various American cities throughout the show's run. The production makes extensive use of Toronto's diverse architecture and neighborhoods, along with studio work at the city's major production facilities. For Season 4, the production reportedly used a wider variety of locations than previous seasons, partly to reflect the expanding scope of the story and partly to keep the visual experience of the show feeling fresh. Location scouts for a production like The Boys have an extraordinarily detailed job, finding spaces that can plausibly represent specific American settings while also being practical for filming. The stunt work in The Boys deserves its own dedicated appreciation. The stunt coordinators on this show are responsible for designing and executing some of the most creative and violent action sequences on television, and they do so while ensuring the safety of everyone involved. For Season 4, the stunt team developed several sequences that required entirely new approaches because the specific superpowers and situations involved had never been done before on the show. This is one of the ongoing creative challenges of working on a series with an ever-expanding set of superhuman abilities. Every new power essentially requires the stunt and visual effects teams to develop new techniques. Something that casual viewers might not appreciate is how much rehearsal time goes into even relatively brief action scenes. A sequence that takes up 30 seconds of screen time might represent multiple full days of rehearsal and filming. The actors who perform their own stunts in those sequences, and several of the main cast members do quite a bit of their own stunt work, spend considerable time working with the stunt coordinators to ensure that the movements feel authentic and that they can be executed safely at the required intensity. This collaborative process between actors and stunt professionals is one of the less glamorous but genuinely fascinating aspects of how a show like this gets made. Let us take a quiet moment and think about the writing of individual episodes in Season 4. Each episode of The Boys is a complex piece of work that has to balance multiple storylines, advance character development, deliver on the show's satirical agenda, and satisfy the entertainment expectations of a very engaged and demanding audience. The writers who work on individual episodes bring different strengths to the table, and the variation in tone between episodes is often a reflection of which writer or writing team took the lead on a particular installment. Some episodes lean harder into the dark comedy, others into the horror elements, and still others prioritize emotional character work. The skill of the showrunner lies in making all of those variations feel like part of a coherent whole. The directors of Season 4 came from a variety of backgrounds, and bringing in different directorial perspectives is a deliberate strategy on prestige television productions like this one. Each director brings their own visual sensibility and interpretive approach to the material, while working within the established look and feel of the show. The challenge for directors joining an ongoing series is understanding and honoring what has come before while also bringing something genuinely fresh to their episodes. The Boys has been successful at this balancing act because the showrunners are very clear about the fundamental visual and tonal rules of the series, while also giving directors meaningful creative latitude within those parameters. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 4 was its exploration of found family dynamics and the way that trauma shapes bonds between people. The core group of characters around Billy Butcher has always functioned as a kind of broken family. People who have been hurt by the world in specific ways and who have found each other partly out of necessity and partly out of something more genuine. Season 4 pushed these dynamics in new directions, testing the bonds between characters in ways that felt emotionally authentic rather than contrived. This is the kind of emotional work that separates shows that are merely entertaining from shows that leave a lasting impression on audiences. The casting of guest and recurring characters in Season 4 was handled with particular care. The show has always made excellent use of its supporting cast, and Season 4 introduced some new characters who were received warmly by audiences and critics alike. The casting process for a show like The Boys involves finding actors who can match the very specific energy the series requires, which is a delicate combination of dramatic capability, comedic timing, physical presence, and the willingness to commit fully to material that can be quite extreme. The casting directors who work on the show have developed a strong sense of what The Boys needs from its performers, and that institutional knowledge shows in the consistency of the casting quality. Here is a softer detail to think about as you drift. Many of the props used throughout Season 4 contain hidden details and jokes that are invisible at normal viewing distance, and often only caught by audience members who pause their screens or watch extremely carefully. The production design team puts enormous effort into creating a fully realized fictional world, and that includes populating that world with fake advertisements, fake news broadcasts, fake social media posts, and fake product packaging that all contain jokes and Easter eggs. Some of these details reference previous events in the show's history, others are pure jokes for their own sake, and finding them has become a beloved activity for the show's most dedicated fan community. The fan community around The Boys is itself a fascinating cultural phenomenon worth thinking about. The show has generated one of the most active and creative fan communities in contemporary streaming television, with fans producing art, fan fiction, analysis essays, video essays, and detailed annotation of each episode that sometimes reveals details the creators themselves had forgotten including. The relationship between the show and its fan community has been notably warm, with Kripke and many of the cast members being quite active on social media and engaging with fan responses to episodes. This kind of creator-to-audience dialogue has become more common in the streaming era, but The Boys has made it particularly central to how the show exists in the culture. Season 4 dealt extensively with themes of legacy, specifically the question of what people leave behind and whether any individual action can meaningfully change large structural problems. These philosophical questions are embedded in the plot and character work, but they are never stated explicitly. Instead, they emerge from the specific situations the characters find themselves in and the choices they make under pressure. This is sophisticated thematic writing, and it is part of why the show is taken seriously as social commentary rather than dismissed as simply extreme content for shock value. The balance between extreme content and genuine emotional depth is one of the defining creative achievements of The Boys as a series. The show contains material that is genuinely difficult to watch, scenes of violence and cruelty that are designed to be disturbing rather than exciting. But those moments are always placed in a context that gives them meaning, that connects them to the larger arguments the show is making about power and accountability and human nature. The writers have been clear that they do not include extreme content for its own sake, but rather to make points that gentler storytelling could not make as effectively. Whether viewers agree with those creative choices is a matter of personal taste, but the intentionality behind them is not really in question. Now let us settle even further into something quieter. Think about the editing of Season 4, which is a craft that operates largely invisibly when it is working correctly. The editors on The Boys are responsible for assembling the footage from multiple filming days into coherent scenes, then assembling those scenes into episodes, and working closely with the showrunner and directors to ensure that pacing, tone, and emphasis are all hitting the intended targets. Season 4 reportedly went through significant editing work in post-production, with some sequences being substantially reworked based on early screenings and feedback. This kind of iterative editing process is common on prestige television, and the willingness to keep refining material until it works is part of what distinguishes these productions from lower-budget work. The sound design of The Boys is another element that rarely gets the appreciation it deserves. The sound team is responsible for creating an immersive audio environment that makes the superhero violence feel real and grounded rather than cartoonish. This involves creating original sound effects for things that have no real-world equivalent, things like specific superpowers being used in specific ways. The sound designers draw from enormous libraries of recorded sounds and combine and transform them to create new sonic textures. Season 4 had some particularly impressive sound design moments, where the audio work was doing as much emotional work as the visuals. One thing that has been noted by critics and viewers alike about Season 4 is how well it developed its female characters in particular. The show has always taken the experiences of its female characters seriously, using their storylines to examine specific forms of power imbalance and exploitation that are distinct from what the male characters face. Season 4 expanded on this, giving characters like Starlight, Kimiko, and others material that felt both specific to their established personalities and genuinely surprising in its emotional depth. The writers who worked most closely on these character arcs have spoken about doing deliberate research to ensure these storylines felt authentic rather than exploitative. The character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, has one of the show's most distinctive communication challenges because the character does not speak. All of Kimiko's emotional expression has to come through physical performance and context, which is a genuinely difficult acting challenge that Fukuhara handles with remarkable skill. Season forgave Fukuhara material that expanded the emotional range of this character in ways that were visually inventive and emotionally resonant, and the work she does is consistently cited by critics as one of the show's underappreciated strengths. Let the thoughts drift a little now, like leaves moving slow across water. The Boys is a show that asks its audience to sit with discomfort, to recognize things about the world we live in reflected in its distorted mirror, and to keep watching even when what is being shown is not pleasant. That is a challenging proposition, and the fact that millions of people have accepted that invitation season after season speaks to something real about the quality and the relevance of the work. Season 4 deepened that relationship with its audience, delivering a season that was darker and more emotionally ambitious than its predecessors while never losing the irreverent energy that made the show compelling in the first place. There is something worth appreciating about how long-form television storytelling works at its best. Characters in a series like The Boys develop over years of audience time, and the cumulative emotional weight of that development means that moments in season 4 land with a force that would be impossible to achieve without everything that came before. When a character makes a choice that reflects who they have become over 4 seasons of story, the impact of that moment is multiplied by all of the history the audience brings to it. This is the specific gift of serialized storytelling, and The Boys uses it with genuine sophistication. As you settle deeper and the words become more like soft sounds than things you have to actively process, consider this. The people who make The Boys, the writers and directors and actors and designers and visual effects artists and editors and everyone else in the enormous collaborative enterprise that produces a season of television, are doing work that they clearly care about deeply. The ambition and craft on display in Season 4 is not the product of cynical commercial calculation alone. There is genuine artistic investment in the show, a belief that it matters, that what it says about power and accountability and human nature is worth saying, and worth saying well. The Boys Season 4 is not perfect television. No season of any show is. But it is television that takes its audience seriously, that trusts viewers to engage with complex material and to follow character arcs through genuine darkness towards something that feels, if not exactly hopeful, then at least honest about the world. That combination of entertainment and purpose is rarer than it should be, and when it works, it is worth appreciating. So let those thoughts settle now. The Vought Towers gleaming in the fictional skyline. The complicated people doing complicated things in a world that feels uncomfortably familiar. The enormous craft and effort that goes into every frame. All of it can rest quietly at the edges of awareness now as your breathing slows and the night gets quieter around you. The Boys will be there when you wake up, ready to be watched with full attention, but for now, let the facts and the details and the appreciation for good work done carefully drift you gently towards sleep. Season 4 delivered. The people who made it cared. And that is a comforting thought to carry into rest. Let me tell you something that most people who claim to be die-hard fans of The Boys completely get wrong. They think they know everything about this show. They've seen every season, they've got the merch, they can quote every line. But I'm about to share things about The Boys that will genuinely make you question how well you actually know this universe. Stay with me because some of these are going to hit different than you expect. The Boys is one of those rare properties that exists on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero deconstruction story. But underneath that, there's a decades-long journey that started in a completely different medium, shaped by real-world frustrations, industry chaos, and creative decisions that nearly never happened. And the more you dig into that history, the more fascinating the whole thing becomes. So let's start from the very beginning because even the origin of this story has a fact buried in it that most fans completely overlook. Garth Ennis, the writer behind The Boys, actually created the comic series back in 2006. But here's what a lot of people don't realize. The comic was originally published by DC Comics under their Wildstorm imprint. It wasn't an independent project from the start. DC actually dropped the series after just 6 issues because the content was considered too extreme even by their standards. Think about that for a second. A company that has published some of the most violent and disturbing comics in the mainstream market looked at The Boys and said, "You know what, this is actually too much." That is a statement in itself. After DC dropped it, the series was picked up by Dynamite Entertainment, where it ran for its full 60 issues and became the complete story we now know. So the very existence of The Boys as a finished work is partly thanks to a publisher willing to let Ennis go where he wanted to go without interference. That creative freedom is baked into the DNA of the source material, and you can feel it in the tone of everything that followed. Now let's talk about the show itself, because the journey from comic page to streaming platform was anything but smooth. The Boys television series was actually developed first for the American Broadcast Network. It was originally set up at Cinemax, which is an HBO subsidiary. The show was being built for that platform when Amazon Studios stepped in and acquired it. That transition happened in 2018 when Amazon picked up the show and immediately ordered it straight to series. No pilot, no development limbo. They saw what the creative team was building and committed to it right away. That kind of confidence from a streamer is rare, and it changed the trajectory of the show entirely because Amazon gave the creative team the freedom and the budget to go places that a traditional network never would have allowed. Eric Kripke, who most people know as the creator of Supernatural, was the showrunner brought in to adapt the material. And this is where it gets interesting, because Kripke had actually been trying to develop The Boys for television for years before it finally happened. His persistence with this particular property is part of why the show has such a clear and consistent vision. This wasn't a project handed to him. He fought to make it exist. Let's talk about casting, because there are some genuinely surprising stories here that most casual fans have never heard. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most iconic characters in the show, almost didn't take the role. According to what he has shared in interviews, he was initially uncertain about committing to a television series because he had primarily built his career in film. Urban had done major blockbuster franchises including Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. The idea of transitioning to a streaming series was a bigger mental shift than people might assume. What ultimately convinced him was the quality of the writing and the character himself. Billy Butcher is genuinely one of the most complex anti-heroes in modern television, and Urban recognized that. The rest is history, obviously, but that near miss is worth sitting with. Now here is something that surprises people when they find out. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays Homelander, the main antagonist of the series, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the all-American voice he uses for the character. Starr has spoken about how he actually spent significant time developing the specific Midwestern American quality to Homelander's speech, understanding that the voice was as important as the physicality of the character. The way Homelander speaks is part of what makes him feel simultaneously approachable and deeply threatening. That contrast is entirely intentional, and Starr engineered it deliberately. What's even more interesting about Starr's portrayal is something he has described in interviews about his approach to the character. He doesn't play Homelander as a villain. He plays him as a person who genuinely believes he deserves everything he demands. That distinction completely changes how the performance lands. When you watch Homelander have a breakdown, it doesn't feel like a supervillain losing control. It feels like a deeply damaged person who never developed emotional regulation because no one ever held him accountable for anything. That psychological specificity is what elevates the performance from impressive to genuinely disturbing. Let's keep going, because we are just getting started, and the production side of this show has details that are absolutely wild. The cape and costume design for the Seven, the show's superhero team, went through extensive development processes that most viewers never think about. Each costume was designed to simultaneously feel like a genuine superhero outfit and also carry an element of corporate branding. The design team actually studied real-world sports team uniforms and celebrity branding campaigns when developing the looks for the Seven, because within the world of the show, these are essentially brand ambassadors as much as they are heroes. Every detail, including the colors, the materials, and the logo placement, was informed by marketing research. That level of world-building detail in the costume department is genuinely impressive. Here's something wild about the production that actually affects how you watch the show. The flying sequences for Homelander were among the most technically challenging shots in the series. The production team used a combination of practical wire work, green screen technology, and digital effects that have evolved significantly across the seasons. In the earlier episodes, the team was still developing the methodology, and there are subtle differences in how flight looks compared to the later seasons. Once you know this, you start noticing the visual refinements as the show progressed. Now let's shift to something that gets into the deeper meaning of the show, because this is where it genuinely gets fascinating. Eric Kripke has been remarkably transparent in interviews about the political and social commentary embedded throughout The Boys. The show uses superheroes as a stand-in for unchecked corporate power, celebrity culture, and the gap between public image and private behavior. Kripke has specifically discussed how Vought International, the corporation that controls the Seven and essentially owns the superhero narrative in the show's world, was modeled after real media and entertainment corporations. The idea was to examine what happens when the entities that are supposed to protect people are more invested in protecting their own brand and revenue streams than in actually doing right by the public. What makes this commentary so effective is that it doesn't preach. The show trusts the audience to draw their own conclusions. The satirical elements are embedded in the story rather than delivered as lectures, and that's a delicate balance to maintain across multiple seasons and dozens of episodes. Now here is a fact that blows people's minds when they find out about it. The show has an internal Bible, a detailed document that outlines the world's rules, the history of Compound V, the corporate structure of Vought, and the backstories of every major superhero in the universe. This document is reportedly extraordinarily detailed, running to hundreds of pages. Kripke and the writers' room worked on this before a single episode was filmed because they understood that the satirical world they were building needed internal consistency to land its punches effectively. When a show's universe feels real, the commentary embedded in it hits harder. That investment in world building paid off. Let's talk about Compound V for a second because the show's mythology around how people become superheroes is actually one of its most clever inversions of the genre. In most superhero stories, powers are either innate, the result of accident, or achieved through extraordinary circumstances. In the Boys universe, Compound V is a manufactured product. It's a drug. And the implications of that distinction ripple through everything. Superpowers become something that can be created, sold, weaponized, and controlled by whoever holds the patent. Vought doesn't just manage superheroes. They manufacture them, which means every superhero in this world is also a product. That's not just dark. It's genuinely unsettling in a way that feels uncomfortably relevant to conversations about pharmaceutical influence and corporate ownership of biological processes. The show has leaned into this mythology more deeply in each season, expanding the lore around Compound V and exploring what it means that something presented to the public as miraculous and natural is actually a corporate invention with a very specific and troubling history. Now let's get into some behind-the-scenes facts that are a little more personal and surprising. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the audience's entry point into the show's world, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. This is something people sometimes know, but what's less discussed is how deliberately Jack Quaid brings a sense of genuine relatability and vulnerability to Huey that is completely essential to how the show functions. Huey is not a cool character. He's not powerful, not intimidating, not particularly competent in the early going. He's the person in an extraordinary situation who doesn't really know what he's doing, and that's intentional. Having an everyman center character in a show this extreme gives viewers a consistent emotional anchor. Quaid's ability to make that character feel authentic rather than simply naive is underappreciated. There's also something worth noting about the dynamic between Jack Quaid and Carl Urban on set, which both actors have spoken about positively. Their characters have a fundamentally difficult relationship, full of tension and conflict, but the two actors developed a genuine working rapport that helped sell the complicated dynamic between Butcher and Huey. Sometimes the best on-screen chemistry comes from off-screen professional respect, and that appears to be exactly what happened here. Let's talk about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight. Her arc across the series is one of the most emotionally substantial journeys in the whole show. But here's something about her character's development that speaks to how the writers approach their source material. In the original comic, Annie's character goes through extremely dark material that Moriarty and the showrunners chose to handle very differently in the adaptation. The television version of Starlight is more fully developed as a complete person with agency and a genuine moral perspective. The show took what was in the source material and built something more nuanced around it, which is a choice that not all adaptations make successfully. The fact that Starlight feels like one of the most grounded and real characters in a show full of extreme personalities is a testament to both the writing and Moriarty's performance. Now I want to spend a moment on Tomer Capone, who plays Frenchie, because his background is fascinating. Capone is an Israeli actor, and Frenchie is one of those characters who could easily have become a caricature. The European accent, the eccentric personality, the particular set of skills. In lesser hands with lesser writing, it could have been a one-note character. Instead, Frenchie is consistently one of the most emotionally affecting characters in the show. Capone brings a warmth and a genuine humanity to scenes that balance the show's more brutal elements. His chemistry with Karen Fukuhara, who plays Kamiko, created one of the most beloved relationships in the entire series. Speaking of Fukuhara, here's something genuinely impressive about her work on the show. Kamiko is a character who does not speak for much of the series. She communicates through expression, physicality, and eventually sign language. Playing a character without conventional dialogue is an extraordinary acting challenge, and Fukuhara makes Kamiko one of the most expressive and emotionally readable characters in the whole cast. That's not an accident. It reflects both her skill and deliberate choices about how to tell a story without words. Here's something about the show's music that most people haven't thought about. The soundtrack and score of The Boys is part of how the show weaponizes familiarity. Music you associate with comfort, patriotism, and heroism gets used in contexts that make those associations deeply uncomfortable. This is a deliberate strategy. When you hear something that sounds like an inspiring superhero theme underscoring something genuinely terrible, the cognitive dissonance creates a specific kind of unease that pure horror or drama can't achieve. The music team understood that they weren't just scoring scenes. They were participating in the show's satirical project. The show has also made extensive use of pop songs in ways that create jarring contrast. A bright, upbeat popular song playing over a scene of violence or corporate manipulation doesn't feel random. It feels like a comment on how culture packages darkness with palatable surfaces. Once you notice this pattern in the show, you can't stop noticing it. Let's get into some facts about the show's viewership and cultural impact because the numbers here are remarkable. When The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video in July 2019, it immediately became one of the most watched original series on the platform. But what happened between the first and second seasons is interesting. The gap between Season 1 and Season 2 saw the show's cultural footprint grow enormously, partly because audiences had time to discover it during streaming, share it with friends, and build the kind of word-of-mouth momentum that streaming shows often struggle to generate in real time. By the time Season 2 arrived, the show had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The second season also benefited from the specific moment in which it landed. It arrived in late 2020, during an incredibly charged political and social period, and the show's themes about power, corruption, media manipulation, and the danger of charismatic authority felt almost uncomfortably timely. Kripke and the writers have talked about how they sometimes felt like they were writing satire and reality was trying to keep pace with them, which is not a comfortable position for a showrunner to be in. Now here is a fact about the show's production that speaks to the sheer scale of what they built. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for the fictional Vought-controlled American city where much of the action takes place. The production design team does extraordinary work making Toronto look and feel like an American corporate environment, but there are subtle moments where the Canadian setting peeks through if you know what to look for. The production has spoken about this as both a practical challenge and a creative puzzle. Making a show that is fundamentally about American cultural pathologies while filming in Canada requires a specific kind of deliberate production design that the team has pulled off impressively well. Let's circle back to something deeper because I want to make sure we cover the aspects of this show that go beyond fun production trivia and get into why it actually matters. The Boys is genuinely unique in how it handles the question of power and accountability. Most superhero stories, even the ones that try to be dark or subversive, ultimately affirm the idea that there are good people in positions of extraordinary power and those good people will use that power responsibly. The Boys rejects this premise almost entirely. In the world of the show, the existence of unchecked power is itself the problem, regardless of who holds it. Even the most sympathetic characters in positions of power make choices that compromise their principles because the systems around them reward compromise and punish integrity. This is a genuinely radical position for a mainstream entertainment property to take and hold consistently across multiple seasons. It's one of the reasons the show generates the kind of passionate engagement it does. It's not just entertaining. It's making an argument. And whether you agree with that argument or not, the clarity of the show's moral vision is part of what makes it so compelling. Here is a behind-the-scenes fact that might genuinely surprise you. The showroom for The Boys apparently operates with an unusually open process for pitching story ideas. Writers at various levels of experience and seniority have reportedly been encouraged to bring their most extreme and unexpected ideas to the table, with the understanding that the show's premise creates space for almost any kind of social commentary if it's handled with craft. This kind of creative culture is relatively rare in television production, where hierarchy and creative gatekeeping are common. The result is a show that consistently surprises its audience because the writers themselves are encouraged to surprise each other. The spin-off series Gen V, which focuses on college-age superheroes in training at a Vought-funded university, came directly out of this creative expansion. The Boys universe is large enough and coherent enough internally that it could support an entirely separate show with its own tone and set of concerns. Gen V leaned more heavily into horror and the specific anxieties of younger generations navigating a world shaped by forces beyond their control, and it worked because the world-building foundation was solid enough to support it. Let me share something about how the show approaches its most extreme content because this is actually important context that changes how you might think about certain scenes. The most graphic and disturbing moments in The Boys are not included for shock value alone. This is something Kripke has addressed directly. The show operates on a principle that extreme content has to carry thematic weight. When something viscerally uncomfortable happens on screen, it's supposed to make you feel something specific about power, about entitlement, about the ways institutions protect people who should face consequences. The discomfort is functional. It's designed to make you sit with something that polished storytelling would let you look away from. This doesn't mean every viewer will appreciate the approach. The show is genuinely not for everyone, and that's by design. But understanding that the most extreme moments are intentional and structured rather than random helps clarify what the show is actually doing. Here's a fact about Homelander specifically that I find endlessly fascinating. The character was deliberately designed to evoke a very specific type of American mythology. He looks like the idealized version of a patriotic hero, blonde, square-jawed, wearing the colors of the American flag. Everything about his visual presentation is designed to trigger associations with heroism, safety, and American exceptionalism. The show then systematically dismantles those associations by showing you who Homelander actually is beneath the image. The visual design is essentially a trap that the show sets for the audience, using the instinctive comfort we feel around those symbols against us. Anthony Starr has described understanding this function of the character as central to how he plays him. Homelander has to be genuinely appealing in certain moments because if he was simply repulsive from the start, the critique wouldn't land. The danger of people like Homelander is precisely that they are compelling. That's the whole point. Now let me give you something that connects the show back to its comic roots in an interesting way. Garth Ennis, the original comic writer, has spoken about his mixed feelings regarding the television adaptation. He has been generally positive about the show's existence and its success, but he has also noted that the television version makes different choices than he would have made, particularly in terms of which characters receive sympathetic treatment and which storylines get expanded or compressed. This is normal for adaptations, but Ennis's perspective is interesting because it highlights just how much the television version is its own creative work rather than a faithful translation of the source material. The show has genuinely gone beyond the comics in terms of runtime and story development. With multiple seasons running to many episodes each, the television version has explored characters and storylines that the comics either handled briefly or didn't develop at all. In some ways, the show has created a more expansive version of this world than even the original creator envisioned, which is a remarkable thing to happen in an adaptation. Let's talk about the international dimensions of this show's success because they're genuinely impressive. The Boys became one of the first Amazon original series to achieve truly global viewership numbers that competed with the largest streaming hits from any platform. The show found audiences in markets where superhero content had previously been dominated by the major Hollywood franchises, and in many of those markets the show's critique of American corporate and cultural power actually resonated in ways that were distinct from how American audiences engaged with it. Watching a show that deconstructs American cultural mythology from outside that culture hits differently, and that international engagement says something meaningful about the show's reach. Here is one more production fact that I think deserves attention. The stunt work on The Boys is extraordinary and largely underappreciated. The show features incredibly complex action sequences that involve practical stunt work combined with digital enhancement, and the stunt performers who execute these sequences operate under extraordinary pressure given the show's visual demands. Several of the show's regular cast members have done significant amounts of their own stunt work in order to maintain the visual continuity of action sequences. Karl Urban in particular has spoken about the physical demands of playing Butcher across multiple seasons, and how the action sequences have evolved in complexity as the show's budget and ambitions have grown. The fight choreography also carries thematic meaning in the show. The way the boys fight compared to the way the Seven operate in combat reflects the power imbalance at the core of the show's premise. Normal humans against superhumans require completely different tactical approaches, and the choreography team developed a specific language for how each group fights that reinforces the show's underlying dynamics. Now here's something to consider as we come toward the end of this, and it connects everything we've been talking about. The Boys works because it takes its premise completely seriously. It doesn't wink at the audience. It doesn't soften its most uncomfortable implications. It commits to the internal logic of a world where corporate power has captured the function of heroism itself and asks what that world actually looks like for the people living in it. And the answer it gives is messy, painful, frequently darkly funny, and ultimately more honest than the polished fantasy of most superhero entertainment. The facts we've covered today, from the comic's troubled origins to the casting near misses, from the deliberate costume design to the thematic architecture of the score, from the political timing of the show's biggest seasons to the psychological specificity of the performances, all of these details point toward the same conclusion. The Boys is not an accident. Every element of it is the result of deliberate creative choices made by people who understood exactly what they were trying to do and fought to do it without compromise. That's what separates it from shows that simply try to be edgy or provocative. Edge without purpose is just noise. The Boys has always known what it's saying and why it needs to say it that way. That's why years after its premiere, it still generates conversation, debate, and passionate engagement from its audience. It earns that engagement by respecting the audience enough to never simplify its own argument. So the next time you watch an episode and something makes you deeply uncomfortable, sit with that feeling instead of immediately reaching for the remote. The discomfort is the point. The show is doing exactly what it set out to do. And knowing the history and intention behind it doesn't make it less impactful. It actually makes it more. If you've made it this far and there's a fact in here that genuinely surprised you or changed how you think about the show, drop it in the comments. I want to know which one hit different for you. And if you want more deep dives like this one into the shows and properties that actually have layers worth exploring, make sure you're subscribed because there is a lot more coming. See you in the next one.